a decorated Air Force general, 30 years of service, cuffed like a criminal on his morning jog. In his own neighborhood, the officer had no idea who he was, but his wife did, and when she storms the station with photos in hand, the media explodes. This isn't just an arrest, it's a reckoning. And it starts now. The Ohio dawn painted the sky in watercolors of bruised purple and hesitant orange as Dr. Marcus Thorne, Brigadier General, retired, U.S. Air Force, stepped onto the sidewalk. 65 years hadn't dimmed the ramrod straightness of his spine, honed by decades of service, nor softened the disciplined lines etched around his eyes. He adjusted the simple gray sweatband on his forehead, the terry cloth cool against his skin, a stark contrast to the phantom weight of the helmet he'd worn in deserts half a world away. His morning jog through the Cedar Heights neighborhood of Fairview wasn't just for fitness. It was a moving meditation, a steady rhythm of breath and footfall that helped keep the ghosts of Kandahar and Fallujah at bay. Cedar Heights was the kind of neighborhood featured in glossy magazines, mature oaks forming a canopy over wide, quiet streets, lawns clipped with geometric precision, sprawling brick colonials set back with an air of comfortable privacy. It was predominantly white, affluent, and, in recent years, dotted with gestures of solidarity. Faded Black Lives Matter signs, bleached by successive summers, stood sentinel on several lawns, their initial boldness muted into the landscape like old battle ribbons. Marcus appreciated the sentiment even as a part of him, the part forged in the crucible of command where actions always outweighed declarations, remained quietly skeptical. He nodded a greeting to Mrs. Gupta, whose vibrant sari was a splash of unexpected color against the deep green of her rose bushes. She returned the nod with a warm smile, snipping delicately at a stray stem. Further down the block, the Alvarez twins, Sophia and Mateo, bounced impatiently near their curb, backpacks dwarfing their small frames as they waited for the school bus. Marcus offered a wave. They waved back with the uninhibited enthusiasm of 8-year-olds. He was a familiar figure here, the quiet black gentleman with the military bearing who kept mostly to himself but offered polite greetings. He was Dr. Thorne, the retired fellow down the street. Few, if any, knew about the stars he'd once worn on his shoulders. He rounded the corner onto Sycamore Lane, his breathing deep and even, his mind starting to clear. The steady cadence was working its magic. He focused on the dappled sunlight filtering through the leaves, the scent of damp earth and cut grass, the distant chirp of a waking robin. These were the anchors to the present, the antithesis of the sudden roar of engines or the acrid smell of cordite that sometimes ambushed his quiet moments. He didn't hear the patrol car approach until it was right beside him, its engine an unnaturally loud intrusion into the morning's peace. He glanced over, expecting it to pass. Instead, it slowed, pacing him. Through the passenger window, he saw a young white officer, jaw tight, eyes narrowed, tracking his movement. Marcus kept jogging, his pace steady. He'd learned long ago that sudden movements invited scrutiny, especially when your skin was the color of his. But the cruiser didn't move on. Instead, its blue and red lights suddenly flashed, painting the dew-kissed lawns in strobes of emergency. The cruiser pulled slightly ahead, cutting off his path. Officer Dan Brody, 32, stepped out, his movements clipped and efficient. His right hand hovered instinctively near the butt of his holstered Glock. His knuckles, Marcus noted absently, were white where they gripped the now-closed car door. Brody's eyes swept over Marcus, the gray tracksuit, the sweatband, the broad, fit shoulders, the steady, perhaps too steady gaze. "Need you to stop, sir." Brody's voice was sharp, laced with an authority that felt disproportionate to the quiet suburban street. Marcus slowed to a walk, then stopped, planting his hands loosely on his hips, catching his breath. He kept his posture non-threatening, his gaze level. "Is there a problem, officer?" His voice was calm, measured, the practiced tone of someone used to de-escalating far more dangerous situations. "We've had some reports," Brody said, stepping closer. He didn't elaborate. "Reports of a suspicious individual in the area. Matching your description." Marcus raised an eyebrow slightly. "Suspicious? Jogging?" The description he knew was almost certainly vague, black male. Maybe tall. Maybe fit. The kind of description that could fit half the black men in Ohio. "I live just over on Oak Street, officer. Jog this route most mornings." Brody's eyes didn't soften. "Seen any ID?" Marcus gave a small, almost imperceptible shake of his head. "I'm jogging, officer. Just my house key." He patted the small zippered pocket on his tracksuit bottoms. "No wallet? No driver's license?" Brody pressed, suspicion hardening his features. No, sir. Didn't think I'd need it to run around my own neighborhood. There have been break-ins, Brody stated flatly, as if that explained everything. Garage thefts. Folks are on edge. I understand that, Marcus said evenly. But I assure you, I'm just out for my morning exercise. Brody took another step closer, invading Marcus's personal space. Turn around. Put your hands behind your back. A cold knot formed in Marcus's stomach. Decades of discipline warred with a sudden, visceral surge of disbelief and anger. This can't be happening. Officer, I think there's been a mistake. Turn. Around. Now. Brody's hand moved decisively towards his holster. The sound of the school bus groaning to a halt at the end of the block reached Marcus's ears. He saw the Alvarez kids, their faces pressed against the bus window, eyes wide with confusion and fear. He saw Mrs. Gupta, standing frozen by her roses, her phone held up, its small lens glinting in the morning sun. He thought of Kesha. He thought of Zoe. He thought of the men and women he'd commanded, the oaths he'd taken, the flag he'd served under clouds of dust, and the constant threat of death. And here, on a sun-dappled street in Fairview, Ohio, none of it seemed to matter. Slowly, deliberately, Marcus Thorne turned around. He felt the cold, metallic bite as the handcuffs snapped shut around his wrists, the clicks echoing unnaturally loud in the quiet morning air. The indignity was a physical blow, sharper than any enemy fire he'd ever faced. Brody patted him down roughly, finding nothing but the single key. You'll have to come with me, Brody said, his voice tight with perceived victory. He guided Marcus towards the back of the patrol car. As the door slammed shut, sealing him in the cramped, plastic-smelling back seat, Marcus caught one last glimpse of the street. Mrs. Gupta was still recording. The Alvarez kids were still staring, their innocent understanding of the world irrevocably fractured. The faded Black Lives Matter sign on the lawn across the street seemed like a bitter, mocking epitaph to the illusion of safety he'd allowed himself to believe in. The aroma of baked ziti and garlic bread filled the multipurpose room at the Fairview Community Center. Kesha Thorne moved with practiced grace among the tables draped in patriotic red, white, and blue cloths, adjusting centerpieces of miniature flags and coordinating the volunteers serving lunch. She was hosting the monthly Veterans Luncheon, an event she'd spearheaded shortly after she and Marcus settled in Fairview following his retirement. It was her way of staying connected, of honoring the community Marcus had belonged to for so long. She checked her watch, a slight frown creasing her brow. Marcus was usually back from his jog by 8 o'clock, showered and ready for coffee by 8:30. It was nearly 10 o'clock. He'd mentioned wanting to take a slightly longer route today, but this was unusual. She tried his cell phone again. Straight to voicemail. Probably just forgot to charge it. Still, a thread of unease began to weave itself through her practiced calm. Across the room, their 16-year-old daughter, Zoe, sat hunched over her phone, thumbs flying across the screen. She was supposed to be helping serve drinks but was currently engrossed in coordinating a TikTok dance challenge with her friends. Every so often, though, she'd glance towards the entrance, then at her father's conspicuously empty chair at the head table reserved for guest speakers. He wasn't speaking today, but he always came, always spent time talking with the other vets, sharing stories that Kesha knew were carefully curated, omitting the rawest edges of their experiences. Zoe, honey, water pitcher on table 3 needs refilling, Kesha called gently. Zoe looked up, startled. Oh, right. Sorry, Mom. She tucked her phone into her back pocket, the casual ease of her generation momentarily masking the flicker of worry that crossed her face as she, too, noted the time. Miles away, Officer Dan Brody sat at a worn metal desk, typing up his incident report. The fluorescent lights of the station hummed overhead, casting a sterile pallor on everything. He described the encounter on Sycamore Lane, carefully choosing his words. Subject matched description, refused to provide identification, became agitated, resisted verbal commands. He omitted Marcus's calm demeanor, his stated reason for having no ID, the presence of neighborhood witnesses. He typed resisting arrest as the primary charge, adding obstruction of official business. Felt solid, justified. He'd followed procedure based on the dispatch call about a suspicious black male after the recent garage thefts. The guy was built, looked strong, could easily overpower someone trying to stop a break-in. Brody pushed down the fleeting image of the man's steady, unwavering eyes. Eyes that hadn't looked like any thief's he'd ever collared. He printed the report and dropped it in the inbox outside Chief Linda Harper's office. Harper, a seasoned officer who had navigated the tricky political landscape of Fairview for 15 years, picked it up later that morning. She scanned it quickly, her gaze lingering on the demographic details. Subject, black male, age approximate 60s. Arresting Officer Brody, D. Location Cedar Heights. She sighed inwardly. Cedar Heights. Fairview was 73% white, and Cedar Heights skewed even higher. This was Brody's third profiling complaint accusation in 2 years, though the previous ones hadn't stuck. The town council was already breathing down her neck about community relations. This could be problematic. She made a mental note to review Brody's body cam footage later, assuming he'd remembered to activate it properly this time. In the small, cluttered newsroom of the Fairview Gazette, the town's weekly paper, Anika Patel leaned back in her chair, scrolling through the police blotter that had just been emailed over. Most of it was minor offender bender on Main Street, a noise complaint about barking dogs. Then she saw the arrest report from Cedar Heights. John Doe, resisting arrest, obstruction. Booked around 8:30 a.m. Race, black. Location, Sycamore Lane. Something pinged in her reporter's intuition. Cedar Heights rarely saw arrests, especially not of residents, and certainly not for something as vague as obstruction during morning jog hours. She did a quick search in their digital archives for the arresting officer, Dan Brody. 2 previous articles popped up, both referencing internal investigations. One involved a rough arrest at a high school football game, the other a complaint about pulling over a Latino family multiple times in 1 week. Neither had resulted in public discipline, but the pattern was there. Anika bookmarked the files and started making calls, trying to find out who the John Doe was. Meanwhile, at the Fairview Rec Center, Jamal Wright, a community activist in his late 20s with boundless energy and a booming voice, addressed a group of restless teenagers gathered for an after-school program. News of an arrest in Cedar Heights had already rippled through the town's informal networks. Listen up, Jamal commanded attention. We don't know all the details yet, but we know a black man was arrested this morning in Cedar Heights while jogging. Jogging? Does that sound familiar? Nods and murmurs rippled through the group. They see our skin first, Jamal continued, his voice resonating with shared experience. They see a threat before they see a person. My own cousin, Rashad, pulled over 3 times last month. Why? Driving a nice car in the wrong neighborhood. Ended up arrested for failure to signal when he damn well signaled. It's the same story, different day. He slammed his hand on the table for emphasis. We gotta be ready to stand up. We gotta make noise. We gotta demand accountability. Back at the station, Marcus Thorne sat on the cold metal bench of a holding cell. The initial shock and fury had subsided, replaced by a chilling weariness. He'd spent his life serving a system, believing in its ideals even when witnessing its flaws. He'd commanded diverse troops, judged individuals on merit and character, not color. He'd worn the uniform, borne the responsibility, carried the weight of command. Now, stripped of his identity, reduced to John Doe, he stared at the graffiti scarring the concrete walls, crude tags, names, dates, fragments of despair left by those who had sat here before him. He wondered how many of them looked like him. He wondered how many had stories dismissed, rights ignored. He ran a hand over his face, the phantom weight of his general's stars pressing down on him. Did those stars, that service, that sacrifice mean absolutely nothing on this quiet street, in this sterile cell? The silence of the cell seemed to offer a bleak, unwelcome answer. He closed his eyes, the familiar ghosts of faraway battles momentarily eclipsed by the immediate, stinging reality of injustice at home. The booking process was a blur of bureaucratic indifference and thinly veiled contempt. When Marcus, prompted for his name and occupation, stated calmly, Dr. Marcus Thorne, retired Brigadier General, United States Air Force. The desk sergeant, a portly man with a perpetually bored expression, actually snorted. Yeah, right, the sergeant drawled, typing John Doe into the system. And I'm the President of the United States. Just give me the basics, pal. Marcus didn't argue. What was the point? He provided his name and address again, slowly and clearly. Officer Brody stood nearby, observing, arms crossed. When the sergeant glanced at him questioningly about the general claim, Brody just shrugged. Says he didn't have ID. Resisted when I tried to detain him. Stick to the script. The implication was clear: the man's claims were irrelevant, perhaps even delusional. Another box ticked, another potentially troublesome individual off the streets, but the script was already being rewritten outside the station walls. Mrs. Gupta, horrified by what she'd witnessed, had immediately sent the video from her phone to her daughter, who, recognizing the gravity of the situation, posted it to Twitter. Within hours, the clip, showing a calm, gray-haired black man in a tracksuit being handcuffed on a peaceful suburban street, while children watched from a school bus, began to spread like wildfire. Someone recognized Marcus from a veterans event photo. The hashtag #GeneralThorne started trending. By early afternoon, Kesha Thorne, frantic with worry after hours of unanswered calls, finally got through to a neighbor who had heard the commotion. The neighbor tearfully described the scene, mentioning Mrs. Gupta's video. Kesha found it online in minutes. The sight of her husband, dignified even in handcuffs, ignited a fury within her that eclipsed her fear. She stormed into the Fairview police station like a force of nature, bypassing the front desk and heading straight for the frosted glass door marked Chief of Police. She didn't knock, she burst in. Chief Linda Harper looked up, startled, from a pile of paperwork. Kesha slammed a framed photograph onto the chief's desk. It showed Marcus in his full dress uniform, medals gleaming, shaking hands with the former president. Beside it, she placed another, Marcus standing shoulder to shoulder with the current Secretary of Defense at an Air Force Base dedication. "That man," Kesha said, her voice trembling with controlled rage, her fingers stabbing at the photos. "The John Doe officer arrested this morning for jogging while black? That is Brigadier General Marcus Thorne. 30 years of service. Bronze Star. Distinguished Service Medal. He commanded wings, advised Joint Chiefs, and risked his life for this country more times than your Officer Brody has probably written traffic tickets." Chief Harper stared at the photographs, then at Kesha's blazing eyes. The bureaucratic mask slipped, replaced by dawning horror. Her face paled visibly. "You arrested a decorated general," Kesha repeated, her voice lower now but no less intense. "For jogging." Just then, the chief's desk phone rang, shrill and insistent. Her assistant buzzed through on the intercom, voice tight with panic. "Chief, it's the Associated Press on line 1. They're asking about the arrest of a General Thorne." Chief Harper fumbled for the receiver, her hand shaking. Her half-full mug of coffee tipped over, spilling dark liquid across Brody's carefully worded, utterly inadequate report. The stain spread, a symbolic blot on the Fairview Police Department's already blemished record. The carefully contained local incident had just exploded onto the national stage. Fairview, a town that prided itself on its quiet harmony and progressive appearances, found itself fractured. The arrest of General Thorne wasn't just news. It was a mirror reflecting uncomfortable truths the community had long preferred to ignore. At Rosie's Diner, the morning coffee crowd was buzzing, the usual talk of local sports and property taxes replaced by heated debate. "Look, the officer was responding to a call," argued Bill Henderson, a retired plumber whose son was on the force. "Suspicious person reported. Guy matches the description. No ID. What's a cop supposed to do? He should have just shown his ID." "Shown his ID while jogging, Bill?" countered Sarah Jenkins, a teacher at the local high school. "Who carries a wallet when they run? And since when is a black man jogging in Cedar Heights automatically suspicious? That's profiling, plain and simple." "He resisted," Bill retorted, stabbing a finger towards his half-eaten pancakes. "Report says he resisted. The video shows him standing calmly until Brody grabbed him." Sarah shot back, her voice rising. "Mrs. Gupta filmed the whole thing." Similar arguments erupted across town, in grocery store aisles, on neighborhood Facebook groups, over backyard fences. The faded Black Lives Matter signs suddenly seemed less like symbols of consensus and more like lines drawn in the sand. Anika Patel, working tirelessly at the Fairview Gazette, published her story online ahead of the weekly print edition. It detailed the arrest, Marcus's distinguished military career, and, crucially, Officer Brody's history, the 2 prior internal investigations for excessive force and racial profiling accusations. Though neither had resulted in public censure, the pattern was damning. The article, amplified by the national attention, acted like gasoline on the smoldering embers of local discontent. Jamal Wright seized the moment. He organized a protest outside the police station, the crowd swelling rapidly, teenagers he'd mentored, longtime black residents weary of decades of subtle and overt discrimination, white allies horrified by the incident, and veterans, both black and white, furious at the disrespect shown to one of their own. Chants of justice for General Thorne, and profiling is a crime, echoed through the downtown streets. The conflict became deeply personal for Zoe Thorne. At school, the whispers and stares were constant. During lunch, she confronted Mark Henderson, Bill's grandson and Officer Brody's nephew. "Your uncle arrested my dad," Zoe said, her voice shaking slightly but firm, standing directly in front of Mark's table in the crowded cafeteria. Mark flushed. He was just doing his job, Zoe. There were thefts. My dad is a general," Zoe interrupted, tears welling but unshed. "He fought for this country. He jogs that route every single morning. Would this have happened to your dad if he was out jogging? Would anyone think he looked suspicious?" Mark stammered, looking away, unable to meet her gaze. The question hung heavy in the air, silencing the nearby chatter. Zoe turned and walked away, head held high, the encounter solidifying a new, painful awareness of the world's inequalities. Marcus Thorne was released late in the afternoon, the charges hastily dropped pending further investigation. The reunion with Kesha and Zoe was quiet, fraught with unspoken emotions, relief, anger, exhaustion. He looked older, the lines around his eyes deeper, the military bearing slightly stooped under an invisible weight. Days later, a town hall meeting was convened in the packed high school auditorium. The atmosphere crackled with tension. Chief Harper offered a strained apology, promising a full internal investigation. Officer Brody was conspicuously absent, placed on administrative leave. Residents lined up at the microphone, voices trembling with anger, fear, or defensiveness. Then Marcus Thorne stepped up to the podium. A hush fell over the room. He stood tall, wearing a simple blazer and slacks, no uniform, no medals. He looked out at the faces, some familiar, some strangers, some supportive, some hostile. "I served this nation for 30 years, he began, his voice quiet but carrying in the silence. "I wore the uniform with pride. I believed, and I still want to believe, in the ideals it represents: liberty, equality, justice for all. On Tuesday morning on Sycamore Lane, those ideals felt very far away." He paused, taking a deep breath. "The question isn't just why this happened to me. Yes, I am a retired general. Yes, I have a certain profile now that this story is out. But my service, my rank, the stars I once wore, they didn't shield me from suspicion. They didn't prevent those cuffs from clicking shut." He met the eyes of the crowd, his gaze sweeping across the room. "So, the real question we need to ask ourselves here in Fairview is this: if my service and my status couldn't protect me, what happens to the young black man without the medals? What happens to the teenager walking home from the library? What happens to the folks who don't have neighbors with cameras or a wife who knows who to call? Who protects them when the protectors see them as the threat?" His words landed like stones in the quiet auditorium. He wasn't asking for personal retribution. He was demanding communal reflection. He had turned his personal indignity into a universal challenge. The unraveling of Fairview's placid facade was complete, replaced by the stark, unavoidable imperative to confront the bias within its own heart. Officer Dan Brody sat stiffly in a plastic chair outside the Internal Affairs office, waiting to be interviewed. Suspended. The word echoed in the sterile silence of the hallway. He thought of the carefully constructed life he'd built, the mortgage on the small ranch house, the car payments, the upcoming bill for his son's braces. He thought of his wife, Erin. She had pleaded with him last night, her face etched with worry. "Dan, just tell them what happened. Cooperate. We need your paycheck. We can't lose the house." He'd mumbled reassurances, but the fear in her eyes mirrored his own gnawing anxiety. He'd become a cop to make a difference, to protect people. But looking back at the arrest, at the assumptions he'd made based on a vague description and the color of a man's skin, a sliver of doubt, cold and sharp, pierced his defensiveness. Had he seen a potential thief, or had he seen a black man in a wealthy neighborhood and jumped to conclusions? Anika Patel conducted a follow-up interview with Marcus Thorne at his home. Away from the glare of the town hall, Marcus spoke more openly, his voice softer, tinged with a weariness that went beyond the recent events. He talked about his transition to civilian life, the quiet struggle to adapt after decades in the high-pressure environment of the military. At Kesha's gentle prompting, he even spoke briefly, hesitantly, about his experiences in combat zones, the lingering echoes of trauma, the hypervigilance, the difficulty quieting his mind, the very reasons his morning jog was so essential. Sometimes, Marcus admitted, looking out at his own manicured lawn. The quietest places can feel the least safe. Anika realized the story was deeper than just profiling. It was about the hidden battles even heroes fight, the vulnerability beneath the uniform, and how easily society could inflict new wounds on those already carrying scars. Her next article would reflect that complexity, adding another layer to Fairview's painful self-examination. The town hall had galvanized many. Jamal Wright, channeling the community's energy, partnered with Kesha Thorne. They spent hours in the Thorne's living room, surrounded by papers and coffee cups, drafting a proposal for a civilian complaint review board. They researched models from other cities, outlining a structure with independent oversight, subpoena power, and diverse community representation. They envisioned a mechanism not just for accountability in specific cases, but for analyzing broader patterns, traffic stops, arrest demographics, use of force incidents, to identify and address systemic bias within the Fairview PD. Veterans groups, church congregations, and student organizations quickly signed on in support. The pressure mounted. Chief Linda Harper, facing eroding trust from the community and sharp questions from the town council, announced her resignation, citing a desire to allow the department to move forward under new leadership. Her deputy chief, Maria Ruiz, a respected Latina officer known for her community policing initiatives in a neighboring precinct, was appointed as interim chief. Deputy Ruiz immediately issued a statement vowing transparency, accountability, and a commitment to rebuilding trust through tangible reforms, including implicit bias training and a review of departmental policies. One evening, Dan Brody found himself alone in his garage, the overhead bulb casting long shadows. He stared at the workbench where his service weapon lay disassembled for cleaning. The cold, hard pieces felt alien in his hands. He thought about the general's calm eyes, the quiet dignity even during the arrest. He thought about the jeering disbelief of the booking sergeant, a disbelief he hadn't corrected. He thought about the viral video, the town hall, his wife's fear, his own uncertain future. He picked up his cell phone, his thumb hovering over the contact list. He found the number Anika Patel had published in her follow-up piece, attributed to General Thorne's lawyer but approved for contact regarding community dialogue. His heart hammered against his ribs. He almost put the phone down, but something compelled him to press call. It went to voicemail. Brody hesitated, then spoke, his voice rough. General Thorne, this is Officer Dan Brody. The officer from that morning. I just wanted to say, he swallowed hard, the words catching in his throat. I didn't know. About who you were. I didn't know you were a general. He hung up quickly, feeling foolish, unsure why he'd even called. Later that evening, Marcus listened to the message. He stood by the window, looking out at the darkening street. Kesha came up behind him, resting a hand on his arm. What is it? She asked softly. Marcus played the message. Kesha listened, her expression hardening. Marcus sighed, a deep, weary sound that seemed to carry the weight of centuries. He looked at Kesha, his eyes reflecting a profound sadness. He said he didn't know, Marcus murmured. He shook his head slowly. That's the problem, Kesha. That's the whole damn problem. It shouldn't have mattered who he was. His identity, his rank, his service, none of it should have been necessary to guarantee his basic right to jog down a public street without being treated like a criminal. The fact that Brody thought it did matter laid bare the fundamental injustice at the heart of it all. 1 year later, the early morning sun, warmer now, filtered through the leaves of the same oak trees. Marcus Thorne, clad in a newer tracksuit, rounded the corner onto Sycamore Lane. His pace was steady, his breathing even. The ghosts of Kandahar were quieter these days, though never entirely gone. The ghosts of his arrest, however, remained vivid, a different kind of haunting. As he neared the spot where Officer Brody's cruiser had blocked his path, his eyes fell upon a vibrant mural painted on the wall of the community substation adjacent to Cedar Heights Park. Commissioned by the town council as part of its reconciliation efforts, it depicted figures of struggle and progress. Martin Luther King Jr., John Lewis, and somewhat startlingly to Marcus himself, a rendering of his own face, thoughtful and resolute, looking towards a hopeful horizon. It was a symbol, imperfect perhaps, but a symbol nonetheless, of Fairview's attempt to reckon with its reflection. Things had changed, slowly, incrementally. The Citizen Complaint Review Board, championed by Kesha and Jamal, was operational. Its first report, analyzing 6 months of traffic stop data, revealed significant racial disparities, prompting Interim Chief Ruiz to implement revised stop-and-frisk protocols and mandate enhanced data collection. It wasn't a magic bullet, but it was a start, a mechanism for sustained scrutiny. Zoe Thorne, no longer just texting about TikTok challenges, now led a student coalition at Fairview High called Students for Equity and Accountability. They organized voter registration drives, hosted discussions on racial justice, and successfully lobbied the school board to incorporate more diverse perspectives into the history curriculum. The fire lit within her that day in the cafeteria had grown into a steady flame. Officer Brody was no longer Officer Brody. After a lengthy internal affairs investigation and facing termination, he resigned from the force. He completed an anger management course and implicit bias training as part of a settlement agreement. Marcus saw him sometimes driving a long-haul truck for a regional delivery company. This morning, as Marcus jogged past the park entrance, Brody's rig rumbled by. Brody saw him, hesitated for a fraction of a second, then gave a short, tentative wave. Marcus, after a moment's consideration, gave a brief nod in return. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, perhaps never fully. But it was acknowledgement. A silent recognition of the crossroads they had both navigated. Jamal Wright and Anika Patel were constants at Rosie's Diner. No longer just sources for each other, but collaborators. Spread out on their usual corner booth were notes and chapter outlines. They were writing a book together, tentatively titled Fairview's Reckoning. Profiling, protest, and the path to progress, documenting the arrest and its aftermath, determined that the lessons learned wouldn't fade like the ink on old newspaper clippings. Marcus finished his jog back at his own driveway, stretching slowly as the sun climbed higher. He looked up at the vast expanse of the Ohio sky, the last few stars faintly visible against the brightening blue. He thought of his service, the constellations of discipline, duty, and honor he had navigated his life by. Justice, he mused, was like that too. Not a single, brilliant star, but a constellation requiring countless points of light, individual courage, community action, institutional change, uncomfortable truths acknowledged, persistent effort. All shining together to illuminate the way forward. The chains he wore that day had been invisible until they became terrifyingly real. But the collective action of his community, the neighbor with the phone, the determined wife, the outraged veterans, the persistent journalist, the tireless activist, the awakened youth, had helped to break them. Fairview hadn't magically solved racism, but it had been forced to confront it, to grapple with its own complicity, to take the first difficult steps on a longer, necessary journey. As Marcus walked towards his front door, the smell of Kesha's coffee already brewing, he felt a familiar weariness, but also a flicker of something else. Not quite hope, perhaps, but a resolute determination. The fight wasn't over. It was never over. But here, in the quiet light of a new Fairview dawn, the possibility of change felt a little less distant, a little more real. The constellation was still forming, demanding more light. General Thorne didn't just demand justice, he forced a town to wake up. If that hit you, smash like, share the story, and subscribe for more narratives that challenge power and push change. We're not just telling stories, we're making sure they're seen.